When Americans think about early U.S. wars, they usually jump straight from the Revolution to the War of 1812. But in between those two conflicts was a war that almost no one talks about anymore. A war that nearly broke the young United States before it ever found its footing. This was the Northwest Indian War, and its first major battle ended in disaster. In the fall of 1790, just 7 years after winning independence from Britain, the United States sent an army west into what is now Ohio. The mission was simple, at least on paper: march into native territory, destroy resistance, and force the tribes to accept American control of the land. What actually happened shocked the country. This story is about that failure. A campaign led by an experienced officer, an army made up mostly of militia, and an enemy who knew the land far better than the men marching into it. This is the story of Harmar's defeat. After the American Revolution ended in 1783, the United States technically gained control of a massive stretch of land north of the Ohio River. On maps, this region was called the Northwest Territory, but in reality, the United States did not control it all. The land was home to powerful native nations, including the Miami, Shawnee, Delaware, and others. These tribes had not surrendered. They had not signed away their land, and they had no intention of leaving. British forts still dotted the region, especially around the Great Lakes. British agents quietly supplied native forces with weapons, hoping to slow American expansion. American settlers began pouring across the Ohio River anyway. Cabins went up, farms followed, and conflict became inevitable. Raids and counter-raids erupted along the frontier. Settlers were killed. Native villages were attacked. By the late 1780s, the situation had spiraled into open violence. President George Washington knew something had to be done. Congress wanted action. And so the federal government made a critical decision. They would send an army west. The man chosen to lead the expedition was General Josiah Harmar. Harmar was no amateur. He had served in the Continental Army during the Revolution. He had personal connections to Washington himself. But the army he commanded was deeply flawed. On paper, Harmar had around 1,400 men. In reality, fewer than 300 were trained regular soldiers. The rest were militia, farmers, laborers, and frontiersmen with little discipline and almost no experience fighting as a unit. Many of them lacked proper weapons. Some had never fired their muskets before. Worse still, morale was poor. Militia units were notorious for breaking under pressure, and Harmar knew it. Despite this, the orders were clear: march north from Fort Washington, near present-day Cincinnati, and strike at the heart of native resistance. The target was a place called Kekionga. Kekionga was a Miami village located near the junction of several rivers, in what is now Fort Wayne, Indiana. To American planners, it was seen as the headquarters of native resistance. Destroy Kekionga, they believed, and the war would be over. What they underestimated was how well defended the region truly was. Native leaders like Little Turtle, the Miami and Blue Jack of the Shawnee, had spent years studying American tactics. They knew how militia fought. They knew how officers thought. And they knew the land. Forests, rivers, and tall grass gave them concealment. American columns, stretched out and poorly coordinated, were easy targets. Harmar's army reached Kekionga in October of 1790. The village was largely abandoned. Native forces had already pulled back. Believing the enemy was fleeing, Harmar made a fatal decision. He divided his forces. On October 19th, Harmar sent a detachment of roughly 300 men ahead of the main force. They were led by Colonel John Hardin. Most were militia. As they moved through the forest, native warriors closed in. The ambush was swift and devastating. Fire erupted from the trees. Militia ranks collapsed almost immediately. Men fired wildly or ran outright. Native fighters used coordinated attacks, drawing Americans into kill zones and striking from multiple directions. Within minutes, the detachment was shattered. Dozens were killed. Many more fled. Hardin barely escaped with his life. Instead of reassessing the situation, Harmar doubled down. He believed the defeat was due to militia cowardice, not enemy strength, so he ordered another advance. On October 22nd, Harmar again sent troops forward toward Kekionga. Once more, militia made up the bulk of the force. Once more, native warriors were waiting. This time, the ambush was even more devastating. American units were encircled. Officers were targeted. Command and control collapsed. Men broke and ran through the woods, pursued for miles. By the end of the fighting, more than 100 Americans were dead. Native losses were minimal. It was not a battle in the traditional European sense. It was a textbook demonstration of frontier warfare, and the Americans were unprepared for it. Harmar ordered retreat soon after. The expedition had failed completely. News of Harmar's defeat stunned the United States. This was not a minor skirmish. It was a national embarrassment. The Army had been beaten twice by native forces on American soil. Congress demanded explanations. Harmar blamed the militia. Militia blamed poor leadership. But the truth was deeper. The United States had tried to fight a frontier war with a revolutionary mindset. Untrained troops, weak logistics, overconfidence. Native leaders emerged stronger than ever. The Confederation grew. Confidence surged. And just 1 year later, an even larger American army would suffer an even worse defeat under General Arthur St. Clair. Harmar's defeat was a warning. The nation ignored it. Harmar's defeat matters because it shows how fragile the United States really was in its early years. Victory in the Revolution did not guarantee control. Independence did not mean dominance. This defeat forced the federal government to confront a hard truth. If the country wanted to survive, it needed a professional army. Out of these failures came reform. Training improved, discipline hardened, and eventually, under General Anthony Wayne, the United States would return, this time prepared. But that victory only came after learning the hard lessons written in blood at Kekionga. Harmar's defeat was not just a loss. It was the beginning of the real American army. History often remembers victories. It forgets failures. But sometimes it's the failures that matter most. Harmar's defeat reminds us that the United States was not inevitable. It was fragile. It was uncertain. And at one moment in 1790, it stood on the edge of losing the frontier entirely. This was the first warning. The young republic would either adapt or fall.